It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Aryeh Cohen. He completed his undergraduate work at Hebrew University in Jerusalem in philosophy and Jewish law and his PhD in Talmud at Brandeis University. He teaches all things rabbinic, Mishnah, Talmud, midrash, as well as social justice at the Ziegler School for Rabbinic Studies of the American Jewish University, where he was ordained rabbi in 2010. That's in Southern California. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Rabbi Cohen. Baruch haba, Rav Cohen, Jerusalem.
Thank you, Eric, and for having me. Thank you all for the gracious welcome of this university, beautiful university. This is just pure self-promotion. This is my book, Justice in the City. It's available on Amazon. Buy for your friends. Great Christmas present. Be amazed how many people are just really willing. And if this lecture is on anybody's bucket list, then this book is definitely on the bucket list. So what are we going to do today is actually talk about one of the themes from the book. In this book, I make the argument that there are three foundational principles that are necessary for a city to be just. The first is the one we're going to talk about today, being like God or being like Pharaoh. For those who have to leave before the end, the answer is God. The second principle is that the boundaries of geography, that the boundaries of responsibility exceed the boundaries of geography. And the third principle is the obligation to dissent, from injustice. We're going to be talking about the first principle. Again, the other two principles are available in this book. So here we go. So first we're going to do this in the following way. I'm going to do an on 1 foot run through of all of Jewish textual tradition. At the end of those 3 minutes, you will be masters of that tradition. And then we will take a tour into the deep weeds of one specific Jewish law. And hopefully by following that path from the 3rd century Mishnah to the 7th century Talmud to the through the 12th to 14th century medieval commentaries, and finally also a 20th century French philosopher, we will come back and understand that law is embedded in a very significant principle of what a just city is. And then that's it. Then we go home. So here we go. And it works. So this is more or less the down and dirty map of the Jewish textual tradition. So of course at the top are the Torah, prophets, and writings, which are the foundational, or the Torah is the only one that is necessarily revealed. Rabbinic Judaism is based on the two Torah legend, that at Sinai, the oral Torah and the written Torah. The written Torah is the 5 books of Moses, what Christians call the Old Testament, or the Bible of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the same thing as the Tanakh, all 3 of these, except in a different order, as you probably know. The written Torah is 5 books. The oral Torah then is the rest of this stuff, which is now written down in very vast libraries. So when we start with the written Torah, the oral Torah, the first book that can be identified as a foundational text of Rabbinic Judaism is Mishnah, which was written in about the 3rd century, and its companion volume, the Tosefta, which was written maybe a little bit earlier, maybe a little bit later. Scholars are still debating that. And it sets out the 6 orders of rabbinic law, agricultural law, holidays, personal status law, torts, temple-related law, and purities. The interesting thing is that by the time this was written down in the 3rd century, there was no more temple. So there were no more sacrifices. So most of the bottom here was no longer applicable, but still on the books as law around temple and sacrifice and purities. So those laws are laid out in Mishnah and Tosefta, and in midrash, which we'll get to in a minute. there are two major commentaries on Mishnah and Tosefta called Talmuds. Talmud just means teachings, sometimes referred to by its Aramaic word Gemara, which means teachings. And the Palestinian or the Jerusalem Talmud was written in the 5th century, or it was edited in the 5th century. None of these have, as you're aware, none of these have authors. So there's an authorship. We don't know necessarily who wrote them. We know approximately when they were finally edited. Palestinian Talmud in the 5th century, the Babylonian Talmud somewhere in the 7th or 8th century. And they are, as you can see, not on all of the 6 orders, but on a large portion of them. Then we follow the Babylonian Talmud, and there's a commentary tradition which starts almost immediately after the Babylonian Talmud was written, though the major commentator is Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who's from northern France, died in 1105. And he's the person actually who made the Talmud into something that everybody could study. Before then, it was merely a scholarly work. He did a line-by-line commentary so that everybody could study it. There was a lot of actually interaction between him and some of the Christian commentators at the time. Right after it, of course, his grandchildren, the Tosafists, then took that very easily accessible text and made it into a scholastic project by taking this now book and showing where there are contradictions and then undoing the contradictions and making it something that you had to get a doctorate in order to study. Other important milestones here are the codes. The Talmud, while the Mishnah and the Talmud, while seemingly in an order, is not in an order. The Talmud has the predilection to talk about whatever it wants to talk about, even when it's supposed to be talking about something else. So at some point, Maimonides, probably influenced by the Islamic codes of Sharia, probably influenced by Razali's code, took the Talmud and put it in an order so that each section has an introduction, has a major statement of principles, and then all the laws in 14 different sections, therefore called the Yad HaChazakah. Yad in Hebrew means arm, and Yad Chazakah is the biblical moniker for God, one of the outstretched arm or the strong arm. But Yad also in numerology is 14. So the 14 sections are the Yad Chazakah, or the Mishneh Torah, the rehearsal of the law, which is also another name for the book of Deuteronomy. So Maimonides had a high opinion of his code, and it is the kind of the foundational code. And then another code was written by Yosef Karo in the 16th century. And then from the beginning until the 21st century, there are responsa, which are just on specific issues of law. Somebody writes to a rabbi and says, "What do I do?" And then the rabbi writes back, and then those that are interesting get published. Right? So if somebody writes to a rabbi, "Well, my sister is bothering me, can I kill her?" So there is an answer, but that answer will probably not be written down in a responsa, right? On the other hand, if they ask about the question of abortion, which might have some structural similarities, but is much more complicated and involved, that probably would get written down in some book of responsa. And then we have this line here, which is midrash. Midrash is the second classical rabbinic idiom, which is biblical exegesis of a very specific kind. There are individual books of midrash on each of the books of the Bible, and there are collections of midrash which aren't based on biblical books but are based around the calendar year, but referring to books of the Bible. And midrashim were written starting about the time that the Palestinian Talmud was written, so starting around the 5th century, and midrashim were written all the way up until the 14th century, 15th century. So there are an enormous number of midrashim. Okay, so any questions? All right, now that we got that. Okay, so what we're going to do now, there you go, and thank you, PowerPoint. And then we're going to take a leap from this to the mid to late 20th century and look at Emmanuel Levinas, who's going to sum up or going to add on to conceptually some of the points we make. Emmanuel Levinas, one of the most important French philosophers in the 20th century, though he claimed that the only reason that he would be remembered is because Derrida quotes him as an influence. but he actually is brought phenomenology to France, all kinds of things. And he also was very involved in the Jewish community, especially after the war. He was a prisoner of war, fought in the French Resistance, and was a prisoner of war, and then helped rebuild the Jewish community, and every year was part of something called the National Colloquium of Jewish Intellectuals, and he gave a lecture on Talmud every year. So we're going to take a look at one thing he writes, not in those lectures of Talmud, but in his first major philosophical work, Infinity and Totality and Infinity. Okay, now we're going to move on. So acting like Pharaoh or acting like God? Answer is B. This is, as a review, this is a page of Talmud. So a lot of what we just saw before in that chart is exactly here. So this is a Mishnah, and this is the commentary on that Mishnah. This is the commentary of Rashi. Here's Rashi's commentary on the Mishnah and Rashi's commentary on the Talmud. This is the commentary of the Tosafos. So if you see here, just look at the bolded letters, and the bolded letters are words from the Mishnah, and then the less bolded letters are the commentaries. You see it's a line-by-line commentary, and here you have the bolded letters, and then all that is commentary. You see how the Tosafos managed to make it into an academic exercise. Okay, so we're going to take a look at this Mishnah, and we actually do have it in English. So here we're going to take a look at this Mishnah. This Mishnah has to do, this is in the first, the order of torts. It's in the first chapter of the first part of the tractate that used to be called torts, and this deals with relationships between neighbors, right? Law, okay? So we're actually not interested in the whole Mishnah, but we're only interested in the first half of the Mishnah. They may coerce him to participate in the building of a gatehouse and a gate for the joint courtyard. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says not all courtyards need a gatehouse. So we immediately see the first thing about this is that you can't really understand it by itself, right? So what are they talking about? What are the questions that just immediately come to mind looking at this Mishnah? What's the context, right? What does it mean? There's like, why, right? Good. What else? Who's they and who's him? There you go. Okay, excellent. Basic reading. Good. Who's they and who's him? Gone. Anything else?
What does the gate look like?
All right, what does it look like? What are we talking about physically? Like, what does this really mean? Okay, so these are exactly the questions. Some of them, most of them are actually dealt with in the Talmud. Some of them I'll just talk about right now. So first question, start with Eric's questions, Professor Huntsman's questions. They may coerce him. So what's the relationship between they and him? So usually when we think about religious obligations in the United States, we think about voluntaristic communities. Here we're not talking about voluntaristic communities. Here we're talking about law. So the they that can coerce him, and the word coerce also, I see everybody popped over, but the they is a court. The him is a person who owns an apartment in the courtyard. So we have to think of the situation as kind of like a condominium, except instead of a house where everybody owns their apartments, it's all the apartments are around a central courtyard. And the question is whether they want their courtyard to be gated and have a gatehouse with the gate. So the gatehouse probably said they could have a guard sitting there during the day, make sure the riffraff doesn't come in. So everybody who owns an apartment around the courtyard is part of the him, is one of the him. The they are the people, other people in the courthouse, but since they can coerce, there has to be some form of judicial system, that is where the court comes in. There has to be some sort of mechanism. There is a court, it's called a Beit Din, a court, police, that kind of thing. In some other place, they talk about what does it mean to coerce, and it turns out that it doesn't mean just to, gently nudge somebody or, make snarky remarks at the condominium meeting, but it means, at least in rabbinic times, to tie somebody up to a tree and lash him. So it's, coerce is like old school coercion. Okay, so they may coerce him to participate in the building of a gatehouse and a gate for the joint courtyard, which means that if somebody wants to, if it comes up in the meeting of the courtyard, that, you know what we need? We need a gatehouse. Joe doesn't want to build a gatehouse. The question is whether or not, since there is a majority of people who want to build a gatehouse, Joe has to also build a gatehouse. So the first opinion in the Mishnah says yes, and not only that, but they can sue him, they can coerce him to do it. The second opinion, and this is also the classic rabbinic, this is how we see the Mishnah is not just law, there's always debates. This is a classic rabbinic move. It's debate. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who was an early Palestinian sage, says, not all courtyards need a gatehouse. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, whoa, wait. You can't just decide that just because the courtyard down the block has a gatehouse, we need a gatehouse. If we need a gatehouse, we need a gatehouse. Like all of a sudden people are stealing our grain. You know, we're putting our bicycles in the courtyard and somebody's coming off and stealing them. All right, maybe we need a courtyard. Maybe, you know, whatever, some real reason. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says it's not just a principle that everybody needs a gatehouse, but rather it seems to be that if you're going to coerce somebody to have a gatehouse, it's only in a situation where that is needed. So, of course, the next question, which the Talmud will talk about, we won't get to it, but is what does it mean to need? Right? What does it mean to need a gatehouse? Different understandings of that. We're going to leave that for the minute. And we're going to go on to the Talmudic commentary. Okay. So, the Talmud works by rhetorical devices, which we refer to as technical terms. In other words, things that set up either questions, answers, or contradictions. So the Talmud here starts, this implies that the building of a gatehouse is a laudable thing. So this implies is a word in Aramaic, which tells us that we're now going to set up something which we're then going to knock down. Right? This is only in order to adduce something else. But first we have to answer, what is it that implies that the building of a gatehouse is a laudable thing? Any suggestions? What did we say? In other words, what did we say? This is a commentary on that Mishnah we just read. What did we say in the Mishnah that would bring us to imply that it's a good thing to build a gatehouse? Yeah? There you go. Excellent. Okay, what's your name? Okay, so what Margaret said. If you're going to be able to coerce somebody to do something, then it should be a good thing, right? We don't want a public policy to be able to coerce people to do all kinds of bad things, right? So this implies that the building of a gatehouse is a laudable thing, the fact that you're allowed to coerce people to do it. Now, here we go. So since we had a this implies, we have a however. There's always a however. However, there is the story of that righteous person whom Elijah spoke with regularly. Okay, so we need to explain two things, what a righteous person is and who Elijah is. A righteous person is kind of a technical term, but in general it means somebody who does everything not only according to the demands of the law, but beyond the demands of the law. There are all kinds of different laws about that. And Elijah. Who is Elijah? Elijah the prophet. What did he do? What's unique about Elijah the prophet in prophets, in kings? What? And then? Oh no, he called a fire from heaven, yeah. Right, so that's true. He trash talked with the priests of Baal, and he did a mic drop on them, and then he ran off. But what happened at the end of Elijah's life? He went up, right? He didn't die. Right? So Elijah in rabbinic literature holds a unique position. He sometimes comes back down to talk to rabbis, or sometimes he explains to God what's happening on earth and explains to people on earth what's happening to God. And there are a lot of great stories about Elijah. One of my favorites is that Elijah would, of course, come and study in the study hall with the rabbis. And so one day he was late, and the rabbi who's the head of that study hall screamed at him for why are you late? You should have been here. We started 10 minutes ago. He said, well, it was a problem because every morning I have to wake up the patriarchs in order to praise God. But if I wake them up together all at the same time, the redemption will happen immediately. So first I have to wake up Abraham, then I have to put him back to sleep, then I have to wake up Isaac, then I have to wake up Jacob, and then it took me so long. He didn't accept that as an answer, but I thought it was a good answer. Right? Okay, so there's a righteous person who does everything the best you can do, and Elijah spoke with that righteous person, right? So Elijah would come down and they would have a conversation. They would study Torah together. He built a gatehouse for his house. So the righteous person then built a gatehouse for his house, and Elijah no longer spoke with him. So this implies that the building of a gatehouse is problematic, right? So here we have a contradiction. Now this is the foundation stone of Talmud. You have a contradiction between two sources. Okay. Now, and then the next move, of course, is it is not a difficulty. Okay, we're going to run through the next part of it quickly because there are a lot of different answers, and at some point, it always occurs to somebody to think that the rabbis had too much time on their hands. But so first answer: why isn't this a difficulty that the Mishnah says you could coerce to build a gatehouse, and Elijah says no good? First answer, the first possibility is that this one built by the person Elijah stopped speaking with, by the righteous person, was inside the gate, and this one in the Mishnah was outside the gate. So if the gatehouse is inside the gate, that's bad. If it's outside the gate, that's okay. Or you can say that both refer to gatehouses that are outside the gate, which seems to be okay. It's still not difficult. This one in the Mishnah, which was okay, had a door, and this one, built by the righteous person who Elijah stopped speaking to, had no door. Or you wish to say that both refer to gatehouses that had doors. I see it's kicking in for some people. It is still not a difficulty. This one, built by the person Elijah stopped speaking with, had a lock on it, and this one in the Mishnah refers to a door that had no lock on it. Or, and a lock actually is good because the lock is a way, in late antiquity, locks were kind of doorknobs also. So if you had a lock, you could open it. If you didn't have a lock, you couldn't open it. Or if you wish to say that both refer to gatehouses that had doors with locks on them, this one, built by the person Elijah stopped speaking with, had its lock on the outside, even though I wrote there inside. And this one in the Mishnah had its lock and key facing inside. Okay, so it seems that if a gatehouse was on the outside and had a lock in the wrong way, it's bad. If it had a lock the right way, it's good. Is there a common denominator that we see here about what kind of a gatehouse is good and what makes a gatehouse bad? Yeah. I say that's a typo. The first one is outside. Yeah, so the lock and key are outside. In other words, that people could open it. Okay, so what's a common theme here? Maybe that access. If the poor person can open the gatehouse, so maybe that's good. Okay, so we're going to now. So let's ask a smart person. We're going to take a look at the commentary of Rashi. Over there. Right? Okay. So Rashi, commenting on, and Elijah no longer spoke with the righteous person, for it gates off the poor people who are shouting for money or assistance, and their voices are not heard. And Rashi uses the term tzoakim, shouting. And he again says the same thing, that the gatehouse that's inside the court is bad. Why? It is a deplorable thing since the gate of the courtyard is locked and the poor person shouts, tzoek, and the gatehouse which is inside buffers the voice. Okay. So now the question is, so that's a decent theory. The question is, how does Rashi know that? Right? We read the same text that Rashi read. It doesn't say anything there about screaming. It doesn't say, and Rashi uses the same term twice, tzoek, right, shouting. How does Rashi know that? So this is what's called in literary theory an ungrammaticality. It's something in the text that's jarring, that doesn't seem right. We don't know why. So what we're going to do is we're going to chase down tzoakim. We're going to chase down this shouting and try to figure out what Rashi's doing. Hopefully that will lead us to a larger conclusion. Okay, here we have shouting. It's in the Hebrew also, tzoakim. Okay, so we have two questions that are left open. One we didn't talk about too much, but why did Eliyahu break off his contact with the Chassid? right? It just says that, one is good, one is bad. But what's really there, so bad that Eliyahu broke off his contact with the righteous person, that Elijah broke off his contact with the righteous person. And the second is, from where does Rashi derive the understanding that the problem with the gatehouse is that the poor person or the poor people will be screaming and not heard? So that's what we're going to run down now, hopefully. In order to do that, we're going to go back to Exodus 22, somewhat famous verse, especially for folks who are involved in social justice and other folks also. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. If you do mistreat them, I will heed their outcry as soon as they cry out to me, and my anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your own wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. Okay, so that's that. So how would you summarize this law? If you had to put this on a bumper sticker. Yeah. Okay, good. That's, treat poor people well. It's 3 words, gets on a bumper sticker. Okay. Anybody else? That which you send out returns. That's what you do to other people will come back to you. Okay, good. Now, a lot of people look at this and say that this is trying to teach us that the lesson of oppression is compassion. But the problem with that is verse 23, right? My anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your own wives shall become widows, and your children orphans, right? If you mistreat them. So it's not clear that the lesson of oppression is compassion. It might be that the lesson of oppression is a little different, that you got to choose which side you're on, okay? So let's just keep that in the back of our minds. But we do have here, I will heed their outcry. And the Hebrew tza'ok yitzak, that's that word that Rashi used to shout. So let's take a look at another verse. To expound, right here we're talking about, you should not wrong a stranger or oppressor, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. Let's go back to find out what happened in the land of Egypt that relates to this. Exodus 2, this is just before Moses' first encounter with God. A long time after that, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites were groaning under the bondage and cried out, and their cry for help from the bondage rose up to God. God heard their moaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Right? So what happens here? The Israelites are groaning, and they cry out. Right? They are vayizaku. The Zion is a tzadi in biblical Hebrew. So that's that same word. They cried out, and what happened? God answered them. And what was the next? And the next scene is redemption. God appears to Moses in the burning bush, and we've all seen the movie. Okay, and next, scene 5. This is Moses' first encounter with Pharaoh. Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, not going to happen. And not only that, but I'm going to make things worse for them. The Israelite slaves were not happy about that, and they thought they'd try to lobby Pharaoh. So then the foreman of the Israelites came to Pharaoh and cried, why do you deal thus with your servants? No straw is issued to your servants, yet they demand of us, make bricks. Thus your servants are being beaten when the fault is with your own people. He replied, you are shirkers. I love that word for some reason. That is why you say, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Be off now to your work. No straw shall be issued to you, but you must produce your quota of bricks. So it is the foremen of the Israelites who are tzo'ek to Pharaoh. They cry out to Pharaoh. But Pharaoh does not respond the same way. He tells them that they're just lazy, and therefore they have to make more. So if we look at this together, we see that the paradigm is set up in Exodus 22, that if you cry out, I will heed your cry, right? If you mistreat them, in other words, if you, the Israelites, mistreat the poor and the widow, I will heed their cry as soon as they cry out to me. And this is based on the fact that in Exodus 2, the Israelites cried out, and God heard them. And in Exodus 5, the Israelites cried out, and Pharaoh didn't hear them, but rather told them to go back and do work. So now we understand where my anger shall blaze forth, and I'll put you to the sword, and your own wives become widows, and your children orphans. That's what happened to the Egyptians. Right? So what this law is telling us is that when you hear the cry, answer the cry. And just to bring it home, this is Nachmanides, who's a 14th century Spanish commentator on the Bible, and he's commenting on this very verse, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And he comments, comments about what is correct. This is an important thing when you're writing papers. When you give your answer, you should always preface it by saying what is correct, because then everybody will know that this is the correct answer. Right, professors? What is correct in my understanding is that God says you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him and think that he has no one to save him from your hands. Don't oppress people and think that just because you can oppress them, there's nobody to save them. For you know that you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and I saw the manner in which the Egyptians oppressed you, and I wreaked vengeance upon them. For I, that is God, see the tears of the oppressed with none to comfort them, and the power of their oppressors with none to comfort them. So God is saying, don't understand the current power structure as being immobile, as being static. Don't think that just because now you're in a position of power, that that's the way it will always be, because God says, I see the tears of the oppressed with none to comfort them, and the power of their oppressors with none to comfort them. I, God, that is, however, save all people from those stronger than them. So too, you shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan, for I hear their cries, for all these people do not have faith in themselves, but they can have faith in me. And that last line is actually a very powerful insight into the psychology of oppression. Right? Oppressed people, the hardest thing is to have faith in themselves. Right? And usually they don't. And here, what Nachmanides is telling us that God is saying is that they might not have faith in themselves, but they can have faith in me. So don't oppress, like we said before, don't oppress the stranger. Choose which side you're on. If you're on the side of the oppressors, then God's anger will blaze forth, because even though the oppressed don't have faith in themselves, they know they can have faith in me. And so, if we go back here to this is our Talmud, and we saw that the building of the gatehouse was not considered a good thing if it was a gatehouse which could block out the sound of the poor, right? According to Rashi, according to a commentary of Rashi. The question finally is, somebody might say, okay, I get it. We're supposed to build our courtyards, our houses, our cities in such a way that we can always hear the sound of the poor. We can always hear the shout of the poor when they cry out for help. But if that's so, how is it that we can force somebody to build a courthouse, a gate to the courthouse? It doesn't do anything, right? What's the point? If we're in a condominium situation, a courtyard situation, and I want to build a gate, and I can't build a gate that's going to keep anybody out, because that gate that will keep people out, we won't be able to hear the poor. So what's the point? How could I force somebody to do it? So I'm not the first person who thought of this question. So Rabbi Meir Alevi Abulafia is a Spanish commentator from the 12th century, also thought of this question. So and he says the following: if you were to say, if our Mishnah refers to a case in which there is no door, or that there is a door but no lock and key, or that there is a lock and key but it is on the outside, why do we coerce one to participate? Isn't it so, isn't it the law that the residents of a courtyard might only coerce each other in a manner in which there is benefit or the removal of harm? Yet what benefit is there here, right? It doesn't serve a purpose. And what harm is removed from the courtyard with this gatehouse? For certainly when the poor can enter, so too can thieves enter, right? It's a kind of a useless gatehouse. What's the purpose of it, right? So the implication meaning, shouldn't we be able to build a stronger gatehouse because there might be some kind of a threat there that we're keeping out? And his answer is, still this makes no difference. And that's it. And this isn't like cherry-picked or edited. That's actually the end of the comment. Still, this makes no difference, meaning the principle of hearing the cry of the poor overrides other interests, other legitimate fears. There you go. So much for building a wall, right? The cry, hearing the cry of the poor overrides all other interests. Now, just before we finish, right, just to highlight that, I want to take a look at something that Emanuel Levinas has written. Emanuel Levinas, 1906, 1995. I love this picture. It looks very grandfatherly until he starts talking. Then he's not very grandfatherly. But okay. This is from an essay of his called Peace and Proximity. Now, Levinas, a little background on Levinas. You can't just jump into Levinas. Any philosophy majors here? Okay, there you go. So I can say whatever I want. So by way of introduction to Emanuel Levinas is as I said, a 20th century philosopher. He studied with Edmund Husserl. He was a younger colleague of Martin Heidegger, with whom he had a public break in the early 30s over Nazism. Heidegger was a Nazi. Levinas was not. But Heidegger was very important to his thinking, though Heidegger, as a Jew, lost a lot of his family during the Holocaust and never stepped foot in Germany afterwards. He lived in France. He never stepped foot in Germany. When there was a conference that they wanted him to come to, they had it on the border between France and Germany on the French side. But he said, and in acknowledging his intellectual debt to Heidegger, he said, what can I do, but I can't think without this scoundrel. So it's kind of an amazing place that he finds himself in. But his critique of Western thought up until his time was that, starting with Aristotelian thought, this is very simplistic, but starting with Aristotelian thinking, the way you define a person, the way you define an object of thought is by genus and difference, right? So a chair is just like a table, but it's different because you're supposed to sit on it, right? That's completely simplistic. An animal, a dog is just like a person, except that a person thinks. An animal is just like a plant, but an animal moves themselves. So that's now. These categories of thought, genre and difference, these categories of thought are the way, more or less, the way that Western thought was constructed. And Levinas says the problem with that is that the central object of thinking should be another person. And another person can't be put into our own categories of thought. Because if I meet Professor Huntsman and I said, oh yeah, BYU, A&E, I know this guy, he's a Bible professor, so I haven't met him, I've met myself, right? Because I actually now know all that I already know about things I already know, and he's still standing there. So what Levinas says is that the only thing you can do to another person is respond to them. And he talks about the meeting between a person and another. And he's one of the people who started using the term other capitalized. Between myself and an other is to let the other overwhelm me. Right? I can't grasp the other. When I find an axe, I could pick it up and grasp it, and also then grasp it intellectually. I know how to use it. I know what to do with it. With an other person, you can't do that. That's why that's why the name of his great work is Totality and Infinity. Another person is an infinity as opposed to a totality. He uses language that sounds very theological. Right? So the other person is transcendent. Right? The other person is an infinity and can't ever be totally grasped. The only thing you can do is respond to the needs of the other person. And the meeting with the other person is via the face. So he uses the phrase of face-to-face meeting, and that on the face of the other is a powerful, though somewhat cryptic statement. On the face of the other is written, thou shalt not kill. When you meet another person, you meet their most vulnerable feature first, and that vulnerability shows their complete weakness. But then you react to that by remembering that you shall not kill the other person. So that's background. Probably made it more complicated than less, but here you go. So this is Levinas. By starting with this extreme straightforwardness of the face of the other, right? By this meeting, when we talk about the fact that the only way to get to know the other is face-to-face. We have previously been able to write that the face of the other in its precariousness and defenselessness is for me at once the temptation to kill and the call to peace, that you shall not kill. Right? When you meet another person in their complete vulnerability, so there's that temptation to kill. I mean, you have the temptation of power, but there is also the call, you shall not kill. The face which already accuses me makes me suspicious, but already claims me and demands me. Right? So that accuses me and makes me suspicious is a little bit of sart, that the other person is a limit on me, but it also claims me when the only thing I can do to another person is respond to them. The right of the human is here in this straightforwardness of exposition, of commandment, and of assignation, a right more ancient than all conferment of dignity and every merit. Right? So this is what it means to meet another person, to meet them in their complete vulnerability and to respond to that by responding to that, rather than by assuming, rather than by thinking that you understand them and grasp them. The proximity of the neighbor, and this is really important, the proximity of the neighbor, the peace of proximity is the responsibility of the ego for an other, the impossibility of letting the other alone faced with the mystery of death. So the proximity of the neighbor, and this is kind of the bottom line here, the being close to, the being next to a neighbor is the responsibility that we have for another person. And that responsibility also can only be carried out in proximity. It's only a face-to-face meeting. It's not a meeting of face-to-face to face-to-face to face-to-face. It's that asymmetrical meeting of two faces, of two people, one meeting the other who is transcendent, who demands, and the I, the ego, the I who responds. Concretely, this is the taking upon oneself of dying for the other, to that extent of dying for the other person. Right? And this is, just want to stress one line here, the impossibility of letting the other alone faced with the mystery of death. Right? There's a philosopher named Jill Laufer who wrote a beautiful book called Ethical Loneliness, in which she says that sometimes people want to be alone. Sometimes people are lonely. But most people, even when they're alone and even when they are lonely, have this idea, have this assurance that if need be, somebody will reach out to them. In their head, they're having conversations with other people. Ethical loneliness, or severe extreme loneliness, is when you are deprived of the possibility, you are deprived of the hope that anybody will ever reach out to you. That's what solitary confinement is about. That's what the concentration camps were about. That's what the idea that there is nobody in the world, even if you're walking with other people, who will ever reach out to you. And that's what Levinas is saying here, that this is the impossibility of letting the other alone faced with the mystery of death. So peace with the other goes that far. It is the whole gravity of love of the neighbor, of love without concupiscence. So this is the bottom line. To repeat it, the proximity of the neighbor, the peace of proximity is the responsibility of the ego for another, that's I for another, the impossibility of letting the other alone faced with the mystery of death. And this, I want to claim, is what the Yad Ramah is saying is still this makes no difference. Why does this make no difference? Because it's not merely about this gatehouse in this courtyard. It's about the idea that we have to set up our cities such that we can always hear the cry of the poor or the widow, and such that the poor and the widow, the marginal, the other, will always know that there's somebody to hear their cry. Because if not, then they are in that loneliness which is akin to death. So just figured that I'd finish off here with a contemporary sage, Martin Luther King, from his speech at the Riverside Memorial Church. A true evolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. America, the richest and most powerful nation in the world, can well lead the way in this revolution of values. There is nothing except a tragic death wish to prevent us from reordering our priorities so that the pursuit of peace will take precedence over the pursuit of war. There is nothing to keep us from molding a recalcitrant status quo till we have fashioned it into a brotherhood. That's all I got. Okay, so we have time. I know that there's a passing period in 2 minutes. I took up too much time, but we have time for a couple of questions, and I could stay afterwards if people want.
Please ask your question at the microphone. Right? Tell us who you are, just so it gets on the recording as well. Thanks. Hi, my name's Aryeh Cohen. I don't actually know what I'm majoring in yet, but I wanted to ask if there is anything in any of the rabbinic sources that cite anything other than, like, if you don't do this, God will be angry and his anger will blaze forth and destroy you. If there's any justification other than that, or why we should be hoping for it.
Excellent question. So the idea of the fact that God's anger blazing forth is not said here. So the answer is yes. But the idea, but I don't want to leave this so easily, because the idea of God's anger blazing forth is not set forth as God's anger is really going to blaze forth, but rather as that third point. In other words, if it's just me and you, right, and I'm oppressing you, so there's no reason for me to move off the dime. God's anger blazing forth is a moral obligation. It's the judgment of history. It's being able to step out of myself, right? The way that it is articulated as God's anger blazing forth is to shock you into saying that there's a lot at stake here. Now, there is a whole, the idea of righteousness, the idea of tzedakah, which comes from the word tzedek, or righteousness. There are statements about the fact that the face of God is in the face of the poor person, that sages would give charity before they prayed because of that. That nowadays, when there are no more sacrifices, there is charity and good deeds. I mean, there are a lot of other, Abraham. The central metaphor of Abraham's life was his tent that was open to the four sides to greet guests. But I really wanted to stay with this because this is actually kind of shock and awe morality. It's kind of, you think, because the fact that the institutions are as they are structurally, that's the way it's going to be. But it's not. And that "but it's not" is articulated as God's anger will blaze forth.
My name's Kyle Mahaffey. I'm an undecided major as well, and I was wondering, your title of the book is Justice in the City, so if you had like a specific example of a city that exemplifies social justice through God-fearing principles?
No. I think we lost it. All right. So, it's there is no city. I don't know of any. There's a city there. What I would say about that is what Hermann Cohen is reported to have said about the Messiah. The Messiah is the one who is always coming. So the just city is the city that we're working for. And I don't think there's any city that is completely just. I think there are cities that are working. I think there are people who are working to make their cities just cities.
Hi, I'm Kendall. I'm studying international relations. I was just wondering, in your own personal life, how have you dealt with religious persecution and injustice?
Okay, so you have 2 minutes. So I think that religious persecution, in other words, persecution on the basis of religion, is the worst perversion of the Word of God. In Judaism, we use two terms. There's Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem. Kiddush Hashem is the sanctification of the name of God. It's also used sometimes to mean martyrdom, but it means way more than that. In the Talmud, sanctification in the name of God is defined as when you do something that somebody else looks at you and says, "Blessed is the God of Abraham." And the opposite of it is Chilul Hashem, or desecration in the name of God. And I can't think of anything that is a greater desecration in the name of God than persecution on the basis of religion. We have religious differences, many religious differences. There are religious practices that Jews won't do that other religions do, and vice versa. But as Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, an Orthodox rabbi in the mid 20th century, said, there are different paths up the mountain. Might not be my path, but I'm not going to put IEDs on the side of it.
In your opinion, in your academic life, what has been the most interesting point of study for you, or your favorite?
Okay. Well, actually, I mean, I teach Talmud. That's basically my field of study. And when students ask me, what's your favorite sugya in the Talmud, what's your favorite discussion in the Talmud, I always say the one I just opened. Which is true, because it's all kind of a puzzle, and it's all, really interesting, and I really like it. And the other thing to say is like the project I'm working on now. So the project I'm working on now is working on a project on the politicization of public space in rabbinics and how it impacts contemporary discussions. So in other words, how public space is constructed by political action, and how that itself is a political action, and how that impacts contemporary questions about who controls public space. So that I'm finding fascinating. I don't know if that's at all intelligible, but there you go.
My name is McKay Cathcart. I'm an economics major. I was interested with your example of the gatehouse, if you found any other examples in your studies or in the commentaries of the principle of hearing the cries of the poor or the oppressed, or being more like God.
Yes. So be like God is a very large and contested conversation starting in the times of the Talmud midrash, starting in the 5th century up till now, right? In other words, whereas on the one hand it says in the Bible, be like God, li damot elav. At the same time, the question is asked, how can you be like God, right? Can a person be like God? And so the answers range all over the place, from we could see what God's works in the world are, to no, we really can't be like God. When it says to be like God, it doesn't mean to be like God. It means to do these kind of things. So there's a large conversation around being like God. Hearing the cries of the poor, there is a large discussion in a midrashic collection on Leviticus, which is not coincidentally about sacrifices, but it goes off and talks for chapters about the obligation of poverty relief, and there's talks a lot about that.
Hi, I'm Camille Wisnat, and I'm wondering if you believe the main changes we need to make in order for our cities to be more just will come on institutional levels and through policies.
You're talking quick.
Oh,
so
sorry.
Start again, slower.
If you think the main changes we need for our cities to be more just will be on institutional levels and through policies, or more on personal levels?
Both, but I think that the stress on institutional levels and policy levels, I think that, so I'm going to be talking about this actually tomorrow in the class a little bit, about the move from poverty relief, from personal charity to institutional poverty relief. So just on one foot, if Mitt Romney gives a lot of charity, right? And so let's say he didn't give it through foundations, but let's say he handed it out to people. So if I lived down the block from him and I was poor, so that would be great. But if I don't live down the block from him, so he'd have no way to find me, right? And if you think about the agricultural tithes, so if I live in an agricultural area, so if I live like in the middle of California, so I'd be great because it's kind of the fruit basket of the world. But if I live where I do live in Los Angeles, for me to get someplace where somebody was giving out fruit, I'd die before I got there. So the institutions which can effect poverty relief make sure that everybody gets it, or they're supposed to, right? Of course, there's always problems. It's also the point at which Now, this is also the tension in the face-to-face and justice, right? The face-to-face and the everybody. The institutions are supposed to mediate between the obligation I see when I see you and the fact that there are millions of us, right? And so the only way to do that is by institutions. But here's the challenge. We have to make sure that the institutions don't turn people into cogs, don't turn people into numbers, because that's making them into totalities, right? And that was, before we got rid of most welfare, that was the conversation about the dehumanization of the bureaucracy of welfare. Now we stopped having that conversation when we just decided to get rid of most welfare. But that is the conversation. That should be the conversation, right? How do we? And the place I see, I mean, sometimes they think that the place that it sometimes happens is like in jury duty, right? Everybody comes to jury duty. By everybody, I mean citizens who don't get out of it by other ways. But you're in a room with a lot of people that you don't otherwise see, right? And all those people, then you create relationships, and they then do something, right? They sit on a jury, and they should be getting justice for somebody, for another person, right? And that's a way of kind of mediating that in a way in which people don't necessarily turn into cogs. So the internal is really important, but if the internal doesn't articulate itself in institutional change, it's not helpful. Yes.
Hi, Brittany Hart, advertising degree. Your terminology of a just city seems synonymous with my terminology of a body of saints, the body of Christ, Zion, that kind of thing. My question is, do you think it's possible, and if so, how do we accomplish this, to live in that idyllic state of being while we're in a falling world?
Thank you. That's also another easy question. So I would say, I would recommend that everybody read an essay by Emmanuel Levinas called Cities of Refuge, which he talks about that question. But in a short answer, a short and unsatisfactory answer, the city of justice, or the just city, is not the same thing as what you're talking about as far as I understand. It's talking about a real city where you have to take out the garbage, and there's plumbing, and there's electricity, and people go to work. It's a city in which, a just city is a city right here, right? It's Provo, it's Salt Lake City, it's Los Angeles, in which there are people to whom we owe obligations of justice, right? Economic justice and criminal justice. And it's not an idyllic city, right? The fallenness in your language, which I just think of as reality, right, is what are the materials that we work with. Right? People are sometimes greedy. People are poor. People are don't want to share, right? And so the only way to get from here to there is build institutions that will further justice. The way we build institutions that will further justice is we organize, right? And we recognize that the static oppression is not forever. Institutional racism is not forever. Institutional sexism, it can change, and it does change, right? And we just have to look at the arc of history. We also see that it doesn't change by itself, and it doesn't want to change. And so that's on us.
Hi, my name is Rachel Daniel, and I'm studying international relations. And my question is just, did your views on social justice stem from your religious beliefs, or did you have these views first and then use religion to kind of back it up?
Yep. So, yeah, I mean, it's hard. I get asked that question a lot. And usually I get I'm not saying this about you, but usually often I get asked that question by people who don't like my political views. And so then they say, oh, look, you're just a liberal. By which I say, no, I'm not a liberal, I'm a leftist. But I can't really disentangle the two, because as far as I remember, I've always been an observant Jew, as both my religious views and my political views have changed over time. So it's hard for me to say, which is not to say I mean, I obviously read and, read the newspaper, read lots of books, articles, and scholarship that are outside of religion, and I read a lot of religious texts which have nothing to do with issues of justice. But it's that overlap that I can't really say which, chicken or egg. Okay.